Parts versus People, Singular-Centrism and Plural Oppression by Buck and Justin. So welcome aboard, we're about to take a journey. We are not a lawyer. We're activists and advocates, and we would need to do a lot more research, a lot more years of school, and consult with lawyers to determine whether or not our thoughts on the legal matters regarding these issues are correct. What we thought was going to just be treatment guideline wordings and therapists being assholes in therapy sessions based on what they had read is actually a larger legal and ethical debate about what constitutes a person, what rights a person is afforded, and what limitations should be placed on persons. So we're going to let you know what we have found so far so the community can open this up for discussion, and perhaps we can get the attention of lawyers and maybe even decide whether there's some kind of action to take about these issues. We're extremely passionate about this topic, but none of us more than me, Buck, and I'm afraid that my activism and passion comes out somewhat angry at times, so please note I'm angry at the establishment and at psychiatry, and not at you or the plural community or any particular individual, except maybe Cluft. But we'll get there in a minute. So sometimes I'm angry at the portion of the plural community that calls itself systems, but doesn't use systems theory or thinking, that doesn't acknowledge the full breadth of plurality or multiplicity, and basically styles all legitimate experience after the medical and psychiatric establishment. Some say that their disorder is not an identity. We have a disorder. It's called DID. But we also have an identity, which is plural, and it's not DID, although plurality is a requirement to get diagnosed with DID. I don't think everyone gets the difference between these things. You do not need to have a plural identity for this session to be pertinent to you, but I do have something important to say about my use of plural. If the DSM changes the label for my disorder and the diagnostic criteria, then the disorder I have may change. I may lose something on my medical chart altogether, or it may change title and billing codes. What won't change is my subjective experience of what's going on, the troubles it causes me, the triumphs I've won in terms of building goodwill and internal communication and internal community, and the good memories and fun or funny moments. Because I have an experience, and others have it too, of being more than one in my body. I'm not alone. It can be wonderful. It has moments of being terrible. But frankly, I've never known any other experience, so I can't tell you whether my experience is better or worse than someone who never experiences being many in their body. Psychiatry can't take this away from me by issuing a new version of industry guidelines or insurance billing codes and information. I may be using outdated language for my experiences, but my experiences are still 100% valid and cannot be taken away from me by them changing the words in a book. It's still written by humans and subject to the author's biases and prior knowledge, usually none of which is the experience of being more than one in their body. This gives me my identity. I'm a member of a plural system, and as a whole, we have decided that we identify as plural. This is not a word dependent on that book. This is a word dependent on my experience. If something changes in the book, it won't ever take away my experience. When I meet other people who use the same identifier, we have shared experiences we can talk about, and believe it or not, a shared, if young, culture developing, with guidelines for how we behave in the same space. This means there is indeed an external plural community, and it's a subculture of the cultures that surround it at the moment. But it transcends physical jurisdictional boundaries, is apart from political and psychiatric boundaries, and it is a subculture within the human cultural experience. This session is going to seem anti-psychiatry. So as a nod to our keynote, Mercy of Nu Epsilon Xi, aka the sorority, said, "We are not anti-psychiatry. Psychiatry is anti-us." Psychiatry writes the rules without including plurals at the table. Not me, not you. They have a closed system of thought. People earn degrees and practice their prescribed methods of thought for years before they're allowed a space at the table. No new thought is allowed. And people thinking outside of their prescribed box are blacklisted and purposefully excluded. So you end up with a field created by old white men that doesn't allow new thought, trains everyone of every color and gender, and then demands that they do not push the envelope before they can sit at the decision-making table. So we don't buy it. It's still the same old white male ableist sanist crap, whether or not it's being regurgitated by old white male ableist bodies. And people do try to get there and get to that table. But the process of getting to that table requires essentially either allowing yourself to be brainwashed or getting purposefully thrown out. So in order to gain new information and insights, try out new ideas, or entertain any fringe materials out there, we as a community have to screen and vet the information ourselves and present it to our peers, hence a conference like this. We also simultaneously have some of our peers sitting at the table, fighting for appropriate and fair inclusion, earning the respect to actually be listened to, and making some headway in asking the right questions or helping to rewrite policies. At the same time, we also have the choice of saying, "Time's up, we've got this," and taking care of some things ourselves. We Crisses frequently choose the latter. You may think we're crazy, but someone who may seem crazy one day could be applauded later for changing the world. Psychiatry sets up an adversarial situation by saying that we have to change our basic identity to get better. Years ago, it demonized all plurality as a whole, in total, regardless of dysfunction or distress, and said we are all inherently disordered and need to be fixed. Psychiatry laid the groundwork for a war against plurality in total. It has slowly backed down from that heavy-handed stance with each revision of the DSM. Slowly. But it still has a grip on us. A large portion of people who are plural, but don't identify as plural, are still under the sway of an old white men's institution. So in summary, we're against any medical or psychiatric systems level approaches to human problems that exclude their subjects from the decisions made on their behalf. In other words, nothing about us without us. This is a slogan in many human rights movements. Plurality, as we'll show later, is a normal human experience. This makes plural rights human rights, and the plural rights movement a human rights movement. Why is parts versus people even a question? What is a part of a person? A leg, an arm, an organ? A part is a degrading term. It's about how important it is or what a fractional person is. What rights or protections does a part have? Can a part give testimony in court? And if not, and everyone in a plural is just part of the whole person, then a plural cannot give testimony in court at all. We exist, we are valid, we have feelings, and we ought to have rights. What is a person? We're going to answer that in a moment because it is actually much more clumsy and complicated than it might seem at first. What is not a person? Well, they're in the rub. So what's the problem with not being a person? What is the history of not being recognized as a person? What part of not being recognized as a person is the most disturbing to us? Because many of us are very disturbed by this. So here's a little word association tango for what we think of when we think of entities who are not given person status. Animals, pets, slaves, belongings, disempowered, disenfranchised, unprotected, unheard, discounted, disregarded, abandoned, used, abused, trashed, discarded. Being called apart or told we're not a person can be very deeply triggering and disturbing. It can bring up more than just these associations. There's a societal tax for not being a person. Systemic abuses rendered on non-people for countless generations. Othering, eugenics, genocide, hate crimes. The list of atrocities goes on and on. We need personhood to some degree as a shield and protection. But we're not being given personhood. We're being stripped of rights in the psychology documentation, in the therapist's office. Stripped of humanity, dehumanized. Even those of us who are not human in our system deserve dignity and safety. This is the deep emotional barrier that can kill the therapeutic relationship and cause plurals to burn psychology books. Who the f*** are you to take away our rights and dignity? Headmates aren't belongings or pets. We're all equals inside, or we ought to be. The documentation says we are, but there's some pretty bad mojo in various plural systems across the community where there are folk having inner wars, suppressing headmates, putting them in jail, treating them like enemies, where the host seems to think they're above everyone else, where controlling front is a way of stripping the others of power and control rather than approaching the folk on the inside with the promise of living a better, more peaceful, shared life. There are laws protecting pets, but there are no laws protecting a part of a person. Philosophical existence. In the film What Dreams May Come, based on the book by Richard Matheson, there is this quote. Albert. So, what is the me? Chris. My brain, I suppose. Albert. Your brain? Your brain is a body part, like your fingernail or your heart. Why is that the part that's you? Chris. Because I have sort of a voice in my head, the part of me that thinks, that feels, that is aware that I exist at all. Albert. So, if you're aware you exist, then you do. That's why you're still here. This goes back to the saying, I think therefore I am, by René Descartes. Yet somehow, having only one brain or body, science thinks we're only one person on the inside. One I am, one consciousness. Plurals know that that's a very limited way of looking at life. This does not describe our first-hand experience or our experience of consciousness. So, what makes a person a person? Person, from Wikipedia, July 2nd, 2020. A person is a being that has certain capacities or attributes, such as reason, morality, consciousness, or self-consciousness, and being a part of a culturally established form of social relations, such as kinship, ownership of property, or legal responsibility. The defining features of personhood, and consequently what makes a person count as a person, differ widely among cultures and contexts. In addition to the question of personhood, of what makes a being count as a person to begin with, there are further questions about personal identity and self, both about what makes any particular person that particular person instead of another, and about what makes a person at one time the same person as they were or will be at another time, despite any intervening changes. So, notably, there's no place I could find online to go other than Wikipedia to define what a person is. And the 13 citations and further reading links on the page are philosophy books, dictionaries, and encyclopedias. There's no law books or legal resources that were consulted for this definition. But there was one link on the page that looked interesting. the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies on the Rights of Non-Human Persons, which we accessed in July. What is this organization? The Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, IEET, is committed to the idea that some non-human animals meet the criteria of legal personhood and thus are deserving of specific rights and protections. So I'm going to read the page for you, which there's a link in the description below. Owing to advances in several fields, including the neurosciences, it is becoming increasingly obvious that the human species no longer can ignore the rights of non-human persons. A number of non-human animals, including the great apes, cetaceans, such as dolphins and whales, elephants, and parrots, exhibit characteristics and tendencies consistent with that of a person's traits, like self-awareness, intentionality, creativity, symbolic communication, and many others. It is a moral and legal imperative that we now extend the protection of quote-unquote human rights from our species to all beings with those characteristics. The IEET, as a promoter of non-anthropogenic personhood ethics, defends the rights of non-human persons to live in liberty, free from undue confinement, slavery, torture, experimentation, and the threat of unnatural death. Further, the IEET defends the right of non-human persons to live freely in their natural habitats, and when that's not possible, to be given the best quality of life and welfare possible in captivity, such as sanctuaries. Specifically, through the Rights of Non-Human Persons program, the IEET works to investigate and refine definitions of personhood and those criteria sufficient for the recognition of non-human persons, facilitate and support further research in the neurosciences for the improved understanding and identification of those cognitive processes, functions, and behaviors that give rise to personhood, educate and persuade the public on the matter, spread the word, and increase awareness of the idea that some animals are persons, produce evidence and fact-based argumentation in favor of non-human animal personhood to support the cause and other like-minded groups and individuals. By extension, someone is saying some animals deserve more basic human rights than our headmates are afforded. I have no argument with animals deserving these rights, and I wholeheartedly agree with this page. However, we also possess individual self-awareness, intentionality, creativity, and symbolic communication without consistently getting the individual rights to live in liberty, free from undue confinement, slavery, torture, experimentation, and the threat of unnatural death. I, for one, see this as a big problem. There's actually an alarming philosophical debate, and that's where there lies a big issue. Person is a philosophical concept. The entire concept is just philosophy. And legal rights and decisions are gifted to people who are only philosophically this magical definition of person. A person is not a body, nor even a mind. I think, therefore, I am is hotly contested by other philosophers in an endless looping argument that I is far too bold to assume, but only that something is observing a thing that is assumed to be thoughts happening, not where those things emerge, nor the identity of the observer. In other words, what a person is simply a hot mess. It's not scientific. I'm not even sure there's a legal basis other than precedent or the rights afforded to quote-unquote people by way of precedent and expanding the definition of law. Various humans have been historically excluded. Othering is common for various groups of humans. Women couldn't vote, didn't have rights regardless of race. Blacks couldn't vote because of the color of their skin. Various groups are excluded from basic human rights based on gender, transgender, sexual orientation, religion, country of origin, age, income, or class. And with humans not having equal rights, we have organizations arguing that the definition of people in terms of ethics and compassion should include certain animals, and one day may, according to other parts of their website, include artificial intelligences or aliens. At the end of the day, it's probably best described as a quality something like, I'll know it when I see it. But that deserves hot philosophical debate anyway, because its qualities are unseeable. What we do know is that there are rights and responsibilities granted to persons in a legal sense, which is called personhood. Personhood as accessed on July 2nd, 2020 on Wikipedia. Capacities or attributes common to definitions of personhood can include human nature, agency, self-awareness, a notion of the past and future, and the possession of rights and duties, among others. However, the concept of a person is difficult to define in a way that is universally accepted due to its historical and cultural variability and the controversies surrounding its use in some contexts. If we can't even get a solid definition of what a person is, then perhaps the community needs to double-check the rights and protections we need to explicitly have made available to us. We should have basic human rights and the ability for individuals in our system to be able to testify in court. We're uncertain whether this person thing is or is not a hill to die on. We're still thinking about it and gathering information because there are deep issues in psychology and psychiatry, treatment modalities, and philosophies, and how we are regarded by the industry that is supposed to help us heal. Psychologists define whether we are fit or unfit, and unfortunately we are basically powerless to change those standards unless we band together. It's a catch-22, and they have the upper hand. We can argue, and they can just say we're unfit to argue. But let's move on. What is an alter in DID? So we have criteria A here. Disruption of identity characterized by two or more distinct personality states, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. The disruption of marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and/or sensory motor functioning. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. So to pull it right out of criteria A, what is an alter? Alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and/or sensory motor functioning. I would suppose then that alter is short for alterations, which are the observable traits of the plural system's members. So in other words, it's not the part or the person, it's what is observed. In layman's terms, the existence of two or more observable or reported identities or people sharing a body, where these two identities are defined as having a distinct sense of self and self-control, separate from each other, including different feelings, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, intellect, senses, and/or abilities. We just translated that list of alterations in affect and so on to layman's language. Notably, the alter personalities, or system members as plurals might prefer to call them, can fill any number of those criteria. Some system members are not all of these things, but some are. Then again, not every singular person is always in possession of all of these criteria at once either, and lacking one or more of these does not rob them of personhood. I'm quite sure that this is the very definition of what most philosophers would at least argue makes a person, but that the individual persons in question just happen to be sharing a body or life. And a life is not a person at all. The biggest sticking point seems to be the financial, legal, and contractual implications and ramifications of personhood. and the reluctance of psychology to grant any more than one of these rights to one body. Conveniently, however, their own industry philosophies would give rise to dogmatic expert testimony that could prevent an alter from testifying against a professional perpetrator in a court of law. In other words, this creates a problem where they define who gets the recognition of personhood and thus trust to reliably remember and report their own personal experiences. So this is a pretty big issue. We're not a lawyer. We're not sure how the courts have dealt with specific alters testifying in court. But in case you haven't realized it, a host is also an alter. Everyone in a plural system is. There is no full, quote-unquote, person recognized by psychology living in your body. They insist time and again that we are additively one person. So technically we are all legally and medically if someone were to put a psychologist on the stand to testify whether or not we should be able to testify on behalf of our body, their answer would undoubtedly be no. And this leads to the issue of proper medical care for trans plurals as well. If a psychologist cannot say that we as a person have made the decision to transition, then we don't get to transition. In this way, psychologists are our jailers and oppressors. We do not live in liberty or free of undue confinement. There is no way as a legal group entity we can prove to them what portion or percent of our headmates have agreed to a medical procedure, witnessed an event, or wish to press charges against someone. Disruption of identity. This might be a big point of argument. We feel that we developed many identities in parallel as a child, not that our identity was disrupted. We were too young to have an identity to disrupt. We do know others feel this way, however, one of many subjective differences among plural systems throughout the community. What are an alter's experiences, according to the ISST-D and their 2011 Adult Treatment Guidelines? Differences in visual acuity, medical responses, allergies, plasma glucose levels in diabetic patients, heart rate, blood pressure readings, galvanic skin response, muscle tension, laterality, immune function, electroencephalography, and evoked potential patterns, functional magnetic resonance imaging activation, and brain activation and regional blood flow. Our physiology is different. Our body could probably teach science and medicine a great deal about genetic expression and so on. Even if our body is the instrument used or played by a singular person, we each play our shared instrument differently in a plural system. Why does psychology's definition even matter? Because they're guardians of the status quo. It's widely recognized in both philosophy and psychology that psychology are the gatekeepers of the status quo. As times change, definitions of what is disorderly or abnormal change. Among the wide range of what is actually normal within human behavior, it is the public majority that decide a narrow range of what is acceptable, and that is what is defined as quote-unquote normal, and the diagnostic manuals are rewritten as those definitions change. This is how homosexuality was once aberrant behavior and considered a mental illness, but no longer is. Now it is seen as a normal expression of being human within a broad range of what it means to be human. It's not that homosexuality changed. It's been here since the dawn of mankind. What has changed is that society passed a tipping point of accepting homosexuality as being within its narrow definition of what is normal and okay. So pressure was put on the industry of psychology and psychiatry to change their diagnostic book to accept homosexuality as being okay and not in itself a medical or psychiatric condition. Thus, psychology is in itself a gatekeeping institution. There's nothing abnormal about DID. 1 to 3% of the population is significant. It's only considered abnormal because psychiatry defined it as such, and that's because society doesn't want to accept it as normal and make accommodations for it. There's good and bad things about this. These definitions are used to decide who gets care and treatment for what disorders covered by their medical insurance. These definitions are used to decide who gets access to institutionalization for help with problems that are well within the range of normal human experience as a whole. One day maybe we'll stop calling anything within human experience abnormal and just say what does and does not require covered assistance so that someone can live the life they want, pain and disease-free. We don't need the additional oppression and stigmatization of being told that something that happens to so many other people is abnormal. Regardless, psychology has a hand in pushing back against plural system member personhood. Person is a quasi-legal concept or has legal ramifications. Such as corporate personhood, it's not always flesh and blood. It includes the right to enter into contracts, for example, or to vote with your money through campaign contributions. However, the concept of what achieves legal personhood changes over time in various cultures. The right to vote is not always granted to every human. For example, if you're under 18, you cannot vote in political elections. But undeniably, you are still a person in the moral, ethical, and human rights sense. Thus, a part of the question of granting an entity personhood already also encompasses what rights they do or do not receive. Recognizing dolphins as beings with consciousness, conscience, and thus being proposed protected rights does not confer to them the right to enter into contracts, vote in elections, or make campaign contributions. For plurals, however, as it stands right now, whomever is fronting, as long as their body is of voting age, may vote in an election, purchase property, or sign a contract, and the whole plural group entity has shared legal responsibility, civil and criminal culpability, and legal ownership of property, even if they were not in on that body-wide decision. But the same person exerting those rights at the moment isn't ethically or socially recognized as a person. I don't think there's any plurals asking for legal personhood change on a separate system level, member level. Quite the opposite. And it's not on the table as a movement. I believe that the question of parts versus people for plurals comes from something other than the legal personhood perspective. It comes from a perspective of individual autonomy, social rights and accommodations, and mutual respect. However, the questions of legal personhood are the ones that time and again are asked when singular folk balk at the idea of granting plural system members any type of personhood. Also note that whoever is fronting can sign a legal contract, purchase property, and so on, and get the whole group of us into trouble, but they're not allowed to make a decision, say, to transition. We, as a culture, a plural culture, already are quite aware that we share one body. The plural community believes in shared responsibility on a body-wide level. We already believe that we get one financial benefit per body, such as public assistance and welfare programs, wages, and so on. We are already thinking we get one vote per election for the whole body, and it's up to us internally to figure out how we want to vote and carry it out externally. We also believe that one body serves all jail time and pays all fines. So since Billy Milligan's day, the laws regarding the insanity plea in the United States are much more specific and now would exclude anyone, even in the same body, unless mentally unable to even comprehend their crime. That's usually not the case for plural system members and would be judged in court on a per incident basis, just like anyone else. So we're not looking for financial or legal extras. What we want are human recognition and human rights, such as freedom from oppression and hate. We may very well need the right to individually testify in a court of law, and we need to figure out a more humane way to handle medical decisions regarding our shared body. This brings us around to the psychology guidelines, such as this quote, which is in Frank Putnam's book from 1989, Diagnosis and Treatment of Multiple Personality Disorder, one of the foundational works in the field. Every alter must be treated as an equal. Every personality was created for a reason and with a purpose. To selectively encourage some and ignore or suppress others is to ask for trouble. Favoritism is easy to slip into. This sounded pretty promising. And then we go forward in time, almost 20 years, and we get the ISST-D Guidelines in 2011. It can be helpful to use the terms that patients use to refer to their identities unless the use of these terms is not in line with the therapeutic recommendations and/or, in the clinician's judgment, certain terms would reinforce a belief that the alternate identities are separate people or persons rather than a single human being with subjectively divided self-aspects. So we can have any terminology respected so long as we don't use the people word. Everything else is okay. We aren't saying we're separate human beings with separate bodies. We aren't asking for contractual personhood or additional food stamps. It starts to make you wonder why there is so much resistance to the word people. If it's back to the legal issues, that's not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is respect and decency, protection of our rights, recognition as valued, cherished, conscious entities with our own needs and desires. We aren't sure what happened in the intervening time that we seem to have lost respect in the therapeutic relationship. There's always a possibility, I wonder, that court testimony is part of the problem. Many professionals came under attack, and they may be trying to protect themselves from plurals in court. This is very concerning to us. At the same time, there are very real abusers in the therapist community, and we definitely do not like the idea that the same industry we need to fight for our rights is the one that decides whether we're fit to fight. ISST-D Guidelines, 2011. So this is part 2 of 3. Although the DID patient has the subjective experience of having separate identities, it is important for clinicians to keep in mind that the patient is not a collection of separate people sharing the same body. The DID patient should be seen as a whole adult person with the identities sharing responsibility for daily life. Clinicians working with DID patients generally must hold the whole person, i.e., the system of alternate identities, responsible for the behavior of any or all of the constituent identities, even in the presence of amnesia or the sense of lack of control or agency over behavior. They're saying we're not a collection of separate people, but we absolutely agree that we're a collection of people sharing the same body. They just don't want to use the people word. ISST-D Guidelines, 2011, Part 3 of 3. The therapist should foster the idea that all alternate identities represent adaptive attempts to cope or to master problems that the patient has faced. I'm not knocking this idea as inspiration for how system members came into existence. But when someone has a child and wishes on them the life they never had a chance to live, and attempts to live through their child, it doesn't rob the child of personhood. So, yeah, this may have sparked something, but that something still developed beyond that initial concept into separate and discrete mental entities with their own physiology. To not recognize us as separate to some degree is even going against what they themselves have said. So this is our conclusion about psychology. Who are they serving? So I'll tell you right off, they're not serving us. The whole idea of depersonalizing the alters, if you will, or our system mates, is so that they have no guilt about abolishing us or trying to make us go away. As long as their training materials continually force this idea that we are only a person if we are whole, the better to serve the agenda of making us singular. We have another situation that was brought to our attention where a therapist has breached trust between a headmate and their host. And whether or not that would be a breach of confidentiality or not. People playing devil's advocate for the therapist say, well, therapists say that you're all one person in the same body, so it couldn't possibly be a breach of trust. Disclosing medical information between headmates, for example, would that be a breach of HIPAA law in the United States? Well, technically, probably not, because the people who define what a person is and defend this stance in a court of law would both have the same story. So the treating therapist plus the expert witness therapist would both be in the court of law, and one would say, well, they're all the same person. The other one would say, yeah, they're all the same person. So you can't be breaching HIPAA between headmates. And the plural community would say, but you can breach trust between headmates, and we deserve the right of privacy even from each other. And the ethical thing for the therapist to do is to work with the person who has something to confess. And why is there such a breach of trust in the system that they're not confiding in each other, that they don't trust each other enough to come clean? It's not the therapist's job to breach trust both in the therapeutic relationship and between the headmates and wreck the whole thing. We, as a community, can easily see that this shouldn't be the way that a therapist operates, to create animosity between headmates by breaching trust, plus also create a barrier in the therapeutic relationship between the client and the therapist. So we're going to go another step further. In structural dissociation theory, and a hint of it in the ISST-D Guidelines, if you can get it so that there's only one system member with which you deal as a therapist, all the better. So the treatment guidelines say it's a good idea to come up with internal communication and getting along and building community on the one hand, but then the therapists who read certain well-regarded treatment documentation only want to deal with one of you. And as mentioned in the Structural Dissociation Theory's ableist article on the Power to the Plural's website, this can lead to internalized tone policing, telephone games, and a reinforcement of shame internally of even having others at all. Worst case scenario, the therapist can play head games with whomever they meet, or the person fronting can play head games with the therapist. So to go back to Putnam saying not to play favorites, think back to childhood and parents playing favorites. And that's not always a good thing for every child in the household. There's no scenario in which picking one to deal with is a benefit to the client. It's only a benefit to the therapist because it's easier to keep track of, there's less misnaming and misgendering, and because it is later on used to reinforce the singular agenda of suppressing all but one headmate, whether by actually merging and unification or just by playing king of the mountain and having only one front and everyone else being completely disempowered and demoralized and having slunk away to the shadows. Psychology has many different theories of consciousness, and several of these have concepts that are similar to self-plurality. Superego in Freudian therapy, Jungian theories of anima animus and the archetypes. Internal family systems theory also posits that there's a kind of a normal development of lesser developed interjects that reflect the external family internally, where in plurals we have fully developed identities separate from each other, but interdependent with each other. So the very foundations of psychology continually recognize the pluralistic nature of humankind. The assumption that any human being is acting in their entire and whole capacity at any given moment and not just parts of the whole is unprovable and absurd. The main difference is that we are aware of it and can generally describe it. We may have stronger delineations of it, and we acknowledge and give these so-called parts names, they may have more agency and self-awareness as individuals on their own, separate from, even while still part of the whole system. Independence versus interdependence. Perhaps that's the problem, because we are not entirely independent, right? Everyone is interdependent, but is not denied autonomy, personhood, or cultural rights of individual expression based on their failure to be entirely independent. Any arguments that we lack personhood due to any kind of lack of total independence would be to say that kids aren't people, or actually that no adult is a person. Because there's limits to freedoms for every entity on the planet Earth. Plural system members have natural limits to their freedom and autonomy that our community communicates to newly awakened plurals regarding shared responsibility for everything going on in your body and sharing an external life together, and how communication, community, and consensus will make life far less complicated, so that plural systems everywhere can have a shared life. Cultural plurality. Some of what we've been describing is part of cultural plurality. Plurality can be culturally acceptable, from the microcosm of the family unit, clan structure, or the tribal or overarching culture. The DSM recognizes and must recognize cultural and non-disordered plurality. Internal family systems theory, Jungian and Freudian psychology, etc. Just human nature is inherently pluralistic. We can step into someone else's shoes, be of two minds on an issue, compartmentalize, switch roles, code switch, etc. All part of everyday so-called singularity, but actually part of the natural pluralistic nature of humans. Rigidity, inflexibility, and inability to imagine being someone else, and so on, could be more inherently dysfunctional in society. But on the surface, these seem to be less shunned and stigmatized. Okay, so we see this both in Kluft, actually goes back further than that, like 1984, I think. We see this in Kluft's works, and we see it reflected in just about every single book since Kluft, including Frank Putnam's book, is this whole idea of narcissistic investment. It's a well-known and often quoted favorite catchphrase that we can tell of Kluft's. Either that or just everybody else loves this phrase, I don't know, and they just keep quoting it. But to us, it seems like whenever he's talking about narcissistic investment, other authors keep quoting him. So he seems to have coined this phrase, whether by design or accident, and he seems to have it in for self-expression, and liking each other. Any attempts to further differentiate headmates, dress as we wish, treat each other well, like or love each other, or the desire to continue to live together, ends up being coined as a narcissistic investment, and thus detrimental to this whole idea of unification of all of the parts of the plural or multiple system. Which is really interesting because right after mentioning narcissistic investment in every single book, they also talk about how often unification fails and something else has to be tried, or it fails multiple times, or they thought everything was okay and that the person was merged and eventually it fell apart again. So I don't understand what the psychology resistance to the idea of us all actually liking each other and wanting to live together for the rest of our life is, if even after they discourage us and fight this whole idea and continually try to brainwash us out of it, we still fall apart. It doesn't seem to improve outcomes. I don't know if they've done any studies on that. This whole idea of this agenda that seems to be anti-unification, even though unification continually fails, this whole idea is a major what the It's totally singular-centric. There's no proof that I know of that being singular is preferable to being multiple, and I'd love to see the studies if there are. Especially with the amount of failure in the unification process and how frequently the whole idea has to be abandoned. So when you're singular and you look out for yourself and you love yourself, it's not a narcissistic investment in yourself. So liking your headmates and not wanting them to go away would be narcissistic. It's an extraordinarily singular point of view, quoted several times in the ISST-D 2011 Guidelines and other works, across the treatment books and treatment guidelines in other places. Welcome to this idea of your family is dysfunctional, so you should just eliminate your family attitude. I want to call Kluft out on his narcissistic investment in this idea that this is a problem. I want proof. What studies, experiments, and so on have been done on this? Where are the long-term studies on outcomes of plurals who have allowed their headmates to differentiate and celebrated their differences versus those who insist that everyone is just part or reflection of themselves as a whole? We're not saying every plural needs to differentiate, but we are saying there needs to be a minimum of investment and love in oneself as individuals in order to have investment and love in your system as a whole. You can't be subjectively detached from your headmates. You share the same body, the same brain hardware. You share the same life. You care for the same physical children. I can't even imagine not caring about or looking out for those I share a body with. That's disgusting. It's immoral and unthinkable to us. We know there are plural systems at war inside who have headmates they vilify and don't want to be with, who would push them out of their body if they could, who keep them bottled up or in a jail in their head. And I can say with certainty that those plural systems are making no headway towards living a more functional life with that type of an attitude towards each other. Continuing to focus on this entire concept in treatment guidelines is absurd. They want us to meet each other, get along, and then continually try to brainwash us that we are just parts of one person and don't want us to become narcissistically invested in each other. You can't live this close to other people and pretend you're one person. Which brings us back to the problems of parts versus people. Because in this case, we don't mean legal personhood, we mean respect, wholeness in ourselves, caring for each other, regard, allowing them an opinion, a vote internally, and so on. You can't be interdependent and collaborate with beings that you don't regard as valid in and of themselves. They're not pets we train to be support animals. They're entities with their own thought processes, opinions, and needs. So we're going to say it again. Plurality is part of the human condition. Plurality has been around a long time. Emma last year in the keynote, who went as far back as the 15th century, 16th century, but I'm sure it goes back even further than that. So plurality has been around for a long time. Documented cases that appear to fit the definition of DID have been around since at least the 16th century. It's a part of the human condition in the past. There's no sign of it ever going away. We need to figure out how to accommodate plurals or forever be hurting people for something they have no control over. And that's not a good look anymore. We have the right to exist, regardless of how plurality happens. We have the right to exist without being oppressed, without being stigmatized, attacked, shunned, without being confronted with constant, violent, or stigmatizing media representations of ourselves. So what do we do about fixing these problems? One of the major problems is all these singular-centric medical models. Because if history is written by the victors, then medical models are written by the so-called healthy and normal folk, the majority, the winners in the gene pool and developmental circumstances game. Those of wealth, whose family can afford for them to take the time off of working to go to school, to invest in their own future nuclear family because their birth family has sufficient wealth to allow their able-bodied offspring to venture off into the world and make their own new family. The overwhelming majority of folk who write the medical models, literature, and come up with theories are folk who did not grow up plural or traumatized the way that many plurals have been. They only observe us from the outside, and only observe those of us who submit ourselves to examination due to severe enough dysfunction and discomfort that we end up in the psychiatric system in some way. So let's say some of us never go to a therapist and just live as plural, never bothering to be observed. Some of us go to a therapist and leave before ever getting diagnosed with anything significant. Since it takes an average of 6 to 8 years to even diagnose DID, even if we would qualify, many of us likely leave therapy before we get the diagnosis at all. We get some help perhaps, or hit a brick wall, and just quit and never go back. Or worse yet, the mistreatment and mishandling of our issues leaves us with trauma therapy, whether due to willful abuse or just clumsy mismanagement of our issues. Then there are those who get a DID or OSDD diagnosis and go into longer-term therapy, assuming the therapist even knows what they're doing and goes through all of the stages of recommended treatment. Some quit along the way, never to return, and unlikely to make it to the therapist's lists of statistics. Perhaps the therapist will rationalize their disappearance from therapy. They were faking it. They weren't that bad off. They must have found someone else. Maybe they all spontaneously merged and are now living as a singular. They pat themselves on the back for some mythical miracle cure, and some of these may be true. But maybe they just quit therapy altogether and never return and live their life either awkwardly or successfully without the therapist. Then there are those who make it through the many years of therapy to get to the point of attempting unification. And these are the ones who get reported in the quote-unquote success statistics. All of those lost along the way aren't counted until the point of the attempts to do so. So it already takes a certain type of person or plural to get to this point. And then they do their merging process with the plural system, and some attempt and nothing happens. Some attempt and get some partial successes, reducing their numbers, but still have a group of folk remaining that can't or won't unify. And then some will apparently unify, getting down to one. Following this point, there's a period of support and learning how to care for yourself as a new singular person. We just read in Frank Putnam's book that I think they believe that by the time you get to unification, you're about 70% done. And remind you, you're 6 to 8 years diagnosed and probably another 5 to 10 years minimum in treatment at this point. So if you're only 70% of the way done, you've got a few more years down the road of therapy after this point, right? So now you're in this period of support, learning how to care for yourself as a new singular person. You haven't been singular for decades, if ever, by this point. In fact, in all likelihood, the last time you even thought you might be singular was probably childhood or teenage. Certainly never singular as an adult. So this is a whole new ball of wax. Is it even real? I don't know. I don't know whether a plural just forces themselves into this because they really want it so badly, or because they've been brainwashed into thinking it's the only way out. But here they are, a new person. Some experience it as a sum of their parts, which I think is great if that's the type of plural system you have, that you don't have to lose anything good to be one person. I'm not knocking it. I'm just teasing out the success rate. However, a good number, a very high percentage of those who attempt and succeed at unification fall apart again. So there are all of those who dropped out of this process all along the way, and those who never made it to one person. Then there are those who get to the one person point who fall apart again. I think Putnam says about 30% remain one, but they may need more than one attempt to unify in order to remain one. We don't know if they fell apart again later after treatment, or fell apart but didn't want to tell their therapist because it was so embarrassing, or it would disappoint the therapist. We don't know how many remain one for the rest of their quote-unquote life. It's hard to say unless we follow them until they die and get reassurances that they are still only one person. with such an appalling success rate, they still hold this up as the best route to healing, not counting all the time it takes to get there, and then the time it takes if, or given these abysmal statistics, when it fails to get functional multiplicity. It sounds like a lot of wasted time in therapy that's already protracted. Those of us who don't want this, that are narcissistically invested or whatever, why not just head towards functional multiplicity and make that the goal of treatment? No coercion, no finagling, no convincing, no wringing of hands or exhortations. It's not your life, Mr. Therapist. It's not your place to tell us what to do or what our treatment goals need to be. It's our job to tell you what we want and what our treatment goals ought to be. You're in our employ and you have one job. Help us build the life we want. So do your job. The singular-centric models span all across the medical establishment. Everyone treats you like you have one mind to a body, one opinion, one physiology. We have one body, but it's well established that we have many physiological issues. Recognizing plurality outside of psychology and psychiatry, as well as recognizing that plurality is not always something to be eradicated within psychology and psychiatry, is essential for us to gain back as much as a decade or more of our shared life and to get proper medical treatment. We can talk until we're blue in the face about media stereotypes. I think almost all of us, at least the plurals who are watching this, know how abysmal the media stereotypes are of plurality. There are some half-decent representations out there, and there's some documentaries that are good. But overall, the media coverage and the media stereotypes of plurals is atrocious, and this needs to change. Due to media poisoning from those media stereotypes, as well as a lot of plural oppression in a singular-centric society, we're often feared, vilified, shamed into hiding, ostracized, made fun of, and so on. It's okay for a stand-up comedian to make fun of plurality. There's myriad headlines in the world using split personality for anything from interior decorating to cultures and landmarks. There's more headlines mentioning people with DID because someone's going to jail for some reason than there are talking about the good stuff we're doing in the world. Because most of us are closeted, people don't know the good that we're doing. When they interview a C-suite executive, they're not coming out as plural in the interview. It's only as people are being wheeled off to jail, whether plural or not, and trying to use plurality as an excuse for bad behavior that we make the news. There's been some changes in that, a little. A Google employee coming out here, the Mask Oakland founder being openly plural in interviews. We've spoken in front of audiences so far, up to 300 people ourselves, and talked about being plural. To erase bias and stigma, we need more and more plurals out in everyday life. We need to show the media that we're not just getting arrested, that being plural doesn't just make us bad people, that we need to do great things in the world. We need to increase our visibility in order to start crushing stereotypes and bias in the community. It doesn't have to be you. You don't have to be out as an individual. But those of us who are, when it's mentioned in passing, you can shrug it off. If someone's like, wow, did you hear so-and-so is plural? You can go, so? Or, oh yeah, I've heard of plurals. Sounds boring. We've mentioned some of these issues along the way about internalized singular centrism. It's fully okay to be a plural system who wants to become singular. You can follow the medical and psychiatric models all the way to unification. Our problem is when some of the issues we've mentioned clash with each other. How do you live as functionally as possible during the 10 years or so that you're going to be going through stabilization and trauma work in order to unify? How do you plan to deal with disappointment if it doesn't work? Because unfortunately, in order to unify, you have to come to agreements, and you need to get closer and closer to each other until you become one. Building an internal community is a step on the path to both unification and functional multiplicity. We make this point elsewhere in our books, on our website, in our podcasts. But even though we decided this was our own path in 1986, we got the idea that this is the best path for all plurals, whether living together or attempting singularity, from Frank Putnam. He doesn't say it this way, but if we're going to live together for life, we need to get along. If we're going to unify, we need to get along. So if you all want to hold singular folk up as the ideal you want to emulate and be upset with yourselves when you don't measure up to that model of humanity, go ahead. But you're getting in your own way. Plurality is a totally valid human experience. If we get, on average, 6 decades of adult life, and you're going to spend 1/6 or more of your life plural while working on becoming singular, not to mention any of the years it took to even get to knowing your plural, you have a choice of hating it or liking it. It's okay to like being plural, to enjoy it for what it is, and still decide as a group that you want to become singular. I think what happens is that system members are afraid that their headmates won't want it. If you can avoid giving them a voice or a vote, then you won't have to hear that they don't want it. A good therapist won't let that happen. They're going to be pushing you to communicate with each other and work it out together and decide what you want to do as a group. But there are plenty poorly trained bad therapists out there who will reinforce your poor internal politics and relationships because it makes them feel all the more powerful. Welcome to Clough's narcissistic investment in creating internal strife. Just like extreme singularity can be disorderly, so can anarchy within pluralities. One can be too rigid or too unpredictable. No one is comforted by feeling out of control of their lives. The problem is not inherently in plurality itself, but in the lack of management and sense of agency, predictability, and control. Any system in chaos is in chaos. To try to eliminate the members of a family because the family is dysfunctional is so maybe you can stop family dysfunction by isolating a single member of the family by hook or crook. But now you've created another problem. To get out of bad analogy land, convincing or coercing a plural to become singular is inherently absurd. To throw away the good in pursuit of what only singular folk think of as normalcy, a life we've never known before, in pursuit of what they think is okay, but create consequences they don't have to live with. So what are some of the solutions that we're looking for as a community? The word person both confers a social status of recognition as an entity with certain social rights, respect, and dignity, while it also implies larger legal status and personhood. We definitely want the former on a system member basis. We are not seeking the latter. And I think that's where most of the singular society pushback is, and hence the majority of the pushback from psychology as well. We recognize that we're only afforded the same external personhood status that any other singular body is afforded. We are not seeking additional rights, nor do we think that's fair. We require only one residence, the same food as singular bodies, and there's only one body to commit or pay for crimes, and one body to represent in politics. So what are the things that we need for society to do to help with accepting plurality? We want singular society to start including and accommodating plurals in singular society. What we don't want is extra votes, extra legal protections, extra public assistance or financial benefits beyond those given anyone else with a single body. So what type of changes are we looking for? What are these accommodations that we want? We want cultural recognition, the ability to be out with lower stigma, no shaming for alterations of behavior, and so on. We want global destigmatization. So things like, we're not a joke, we're not scary, and for all cultures on Earth to give us these same recognitions. We want medical autonomy as a representative democracy. So the ability to make whole body decisions without undue scrutiny or anybody telling us how we have to vote, whether it has to be 100% or it's up to us to decide if majority rules and so on. Properly trained medical personnel who understand the difference in treatment and diagnosis for plurals, both medical and psychology. We want safety in a medical setting. We want to be believed and not attacked when we have something to report. If we say one of us gets headaches from having a certain medication, but the rest of us don't, we want somebody that understands that. We want reasonable accommodations, such as differently written instructions for bigs versus littles, chaperones in the treatment room, or representatives to help us out as needed. What kind of policy accommodations do we want? Name issues. We've got humongous name issues, often similar to the trans community. We don't want our legal name or our birth name used and so on for many various good reasons having to do with abuse and trauma, and sometimes just because of transgender issues. And similarly, gender accommodations. We want public event accommodations. Generally, these are a big overlap with autism, neurodivergent, and trauma communities that you might see at those kinds of conferences and so on. Quiet rooms, darkened spaces, separate places, or lowering volume in the vendor area, no flashing lights. All those kinds of things are not so good for us either. We'd love the media revolution with positive plural role models, casual appearances, plural heroes, boring roles, plural actors and actresses playing plurals, and plural representation across the board. And we want educational equity in terms of the training and the coverage in general in school and in classes about plurality, plus proper and appropriate training and coverage in studies for any licensed or certified professionals, social workers, or law enforcement. And we want more than this, and there's a list on our website, there's a link in the show notes. We want more than this, but they're all reasonable and achievable and humanizing, very similar to what we've listed here. They're just more specific. These were the general categories. So here's a list of the resources for our lecture. Some of the things that we mentioned. We just mentioned the vision page is what we want as a movement. Power to the Plurals in their article. All these links are in the show notes below, plus some of the books that we use. We use Putnam's 1989 groundbreaking work. ISST-D's treatment guidelines that are used across the world, the DSM-5, Wikipedia, and then that really strange website that we're glad we found on the rights of non-human persons. So you can check that out too. And we really appreciate you joining us for this. This has been very exciting work for us and made us think a lot about when we call ourselves a person. We're never going to take that for granted, what that means again. Hopefully you won't either. It's a very odd philosophical debate, and we're still not quite sure what it's going to mean. So hopefully you'll join us in a conversation so that as a movement, the plural community has its own movement to get acceptance and recognition. So hopefully the plural movement can get direction from the plural community as to what we want to do with that information. So thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of the conference.